So in this episode, I'm going to talk about the next generation squad weapon program to replace the M4 and M249 SAW. If there's anything I've learned in my time in the military, it's that soldiers hate two things: change and the way things are. And it seems like ever since the new M7 rifles were selected as the new rifle, a lot of people, especially on social media, have talked about how negative the switch is going to be for troops, citing mostly the weight of the rifle and the ammunition. Now, I'm a big numbers guy, so I wanted to run the numbers and see what the actual weight change is going to be, going to a heavier weapon and a heavier round. And I'm going to be talking about it in the context of mountain infantry. So let's talk about the way things are right now in a light or mountain infantry platoon before any of the new changes. This is probably a review for most people listening, but it's going to work into my later points. So we'll start with the smallest group, which is a fire team of 4 soldiers. You have a rifleman with an M4 carbine. The M4 carbine shoots a 5.56 round, and each magazine holds 30 rounds. Typically, the combat loadout is 7 magazines for a total of 210 rounds carried on the body. The second soldier in the fire team is a grenadier who also has an M4 with a full combat loadout, but also carries an M320 grenade launcher with 12 40mm grenades. This grenade launcher is often attached to the bottom side of the rifle, though it can be detached and used in a standalone configuration, which we'll talk about later as well. The third soldier in the fire team is the automatic rifleman who carries the M249 Squad Automatic Weapon, or SAW for short. This quote-unquote light machine gun fires ammunition that's linked together in 200-round plastic drums. They get attached to the SAW, but you could break it up into smaller lengths, and commonly the gunner will walk around with only 100 rounds linked together, loaded into a pouch commonly referred to as a nutsack, loaded into the gun to make the gun overall a little bit lighter and easier to manage. These 3 soldiers are then controlled by the fire team leader, who also carries an M4 carbine. This allows, at the lowest level, some form of fire and maneuver because you can shoot and move in pairs. Typically, when paired off like this, the SAW gunner will stay with the team leader because the SAW is seen as the main source of firepower at the team level. 2 of these 4-person teams are under a squad leader with an M4, making a 9-person line squad. The most recent change I've seen to these squads is that they'll give one of the riflemen in the squad a M110A1 rifle, which is a more precision/distance oriented rifle that fires a 7.62 round. This person's often referred to as the squad designated marksman, or SDM, and in theory they're supposed to receive some more specialized training on distance shooting. In a platoon, there's 3 of these line squads plus 1 weapon squad. Now, the firepower of the weapon squad is the gunner, who carries the M240 medium machine gun, which also fires that 7.62 round. The gunner will also have an assistant machine gunner / ammo bearer to help carry extra ammunition, a spare barrel for the machine gun, and a tripod to mount the gun on when in a static position. This assistant machine gunner carries a lot of weight for the machine gun, but they themselves only carry an M4 carbine. Usually there's 2 of these machine gun teams in the weapon squad, and in my experience the rest of the weapon squad is sort of modular depending on what the mission is. Sometimes there'll be a 2-person team carrying a Javelin missile system, sometimes they're carrying a Gustav recoilless rifle, but either way it's usually a heavy weapon system carried by 2 people who are then also carrying an M4 carbine. The squad is all under the control of a weapon squad leader, sometimes called the Weasel because its acronym is WSL for short. As a side note, this is supposed to be the most experienced squad leader because of all the different weapon systems they need to control. Plus the platoon leader and platoon sergeant both carrying M4s. Common attachments to the platoon include the RTO, or radio telephone operator, and the combat medic, who both carry M4 carbines. So that means in a typical light infantry platoon there are 21 M4 carbines, 6 grenadiers, 6 M249 SAW gunners, 3 designated marksmen, and 2 M240 gunners. So where did this NGSW come from? Well, in 2017, the Army issued out specs for what they wanted from a new weapons program to replace the current infantry weapons, and they specifically chose the 6.8 round to replace the current 5.56. Typically, rounds are named for the bullet diameter, so obviously the bullet that the Army wanted to switch to is bigger than what it currently uses. And the reason they gave was body armor penetration at distance. So right now the standard body armor worn by the US military are level 4 ESAPI plates. They're ceramic plates that get inserted to the vest, front, back, and they are made to protect vital organs, and occasionally soldiers are given side plates as well that protect from the hip bone to the top of the lat. These level 4 plates protect from both 5.56 and 7.62 rounds, so the idea is that the new 6.8 round will be able to penetrate this armor since it's a heavier bullet than the 5.56 and moving at a faster speed than the larger 7.62 with a more efficient shape for penetrating armor and barriers. So what are the drawbacks of the M4 carbine, at least in my experience, from least important to most important? Firstly is the fixed front sight post that attaches to the front of the handguard, which means that the barrel is not free floating. So you have to be careful if you're supporting it on something or using a bipod when you shoot to not put too much input into the fore end of the rifle, or it will very slightly push on the end of the barrel and then also slightly affect where that bullet will go. Next, it is a direct impingement system, which means that the gases from the fired round are then sent back directly into the bolt carrier to cycle the action, eject the spent bullet casing, and load the next round. It's a reliable design, but it causes a lot of carbon buildup in the bolt carrier group because that's where most of the gases are going. On top of that, if you're using a suppressor, this can cause a lot of gas into the shooter's face because the suppressor slows down any gas that's exiting the barrel and forces more gas back into the bolt carrier group and then out the ejection port. This gas irritates the shooter's nose and eyes and is obviously distracting when they're trying to focus on a fight. Now, I don't think suppressors are necessary for every soldier carrying the rifle, but I'll talk about that later on when I get to my recommendations. Next, it's a 14.5-inch barrel with 5.56 external and terminal ballistics. Especially in the mountains, when you have long sight lines and fast-moving wind, the 5.56 is pretty easily affected by the wind. I went to a course in the Caucasus Mountains of Georgia, and even at just 300 meters with the wind that we were experiencing, I had to aim a whole body width to the right of a silhouette target so that the wind would then blow the bullet mid-flight to the left and land within the target. If right before I shot the wind stopped, then I would have missed to the right of the target, and if the wind picked up, I would have missed to the left of the target. This isn't a problem that's unique to the mountains, but it's definitely amplified because of the higher winds. Now, you could switch to a heavier bullet. I believe we were shooting 55 grain bullets, and you can go all the way up to a 77 grain bullets with 5.56. It's a bit heavier, so there would have been a little bit more bullet drop over distance. Now let's talk about the bullet drop of 5.56. 5.56 bullet of any grain weight loses speed pretty quickly. Generally, after 300 meters, it loses a third of its velocity, so gravity essentially has more time to bring it down to the ground as it travels through the air. What does this mean in practical terms? It means your range estimation needs to be more precise in order to not miss high or low when compared to flatter shooting bullets that retain their velocity as it travels through the air. Now, speaking of retained velocity, the 5.56 round is relatively small and light, and it relies on that velocity to actually do tissue damage. To put it in perspective, most deer hunters would never use a bullet that small because you would have to make a very precise shot to a vital organ and be within 200 yards to make sure it still had enough velocity to cause enough damage to the body. Now, take that line of thinking and apply it to an enemy soldier wearing armor that covers the vital organs. This lines up with a study called Increasing Small Arms Lethality in Afghanistan, Taking Back the Infantry Half Kilometer. This was written in 2009, and it actually comes to the same conclusion of 200 yards being the limit of the 5.56 cartridge in combat. Okay, so those are the problems with the M4 carbine. What has the Marine Corps done about this? Well, they replaced their M4 carbines with the M27 Infantry Automatic Rifle, or IAR, and this fixed a couple of the problems with the M4. Firstly, it had a free float barrel, so now using a bipod or pushing against barriers won't mechanically affect the accuracy because it doesn't touch the barrel itself. Next, it is a short stroke piston operated system instead of the direct impingement system. So the gas pushes a piston to reciprocate the internals and load the next round. This keeps the internals a little bit cleaner and gas isn't pushed back into the shooter's face when shooting suppressed. However, it still uses the 5.56 round. It's a slightly longer barrel length of 16.5 inches, so in theory it has a slightly faster velocity coming out of the barrel, but like we said earlier, 5.56 loses velocity very fast. The Army solution was the 6.8 round and the new M7 rifle. We'll talk about machine guns in a minute, but what does the M7 do for us? The M7 rifle has a free-floated barrel and a short-stroke piston operating system, just like the M27. However, it fires the 6.8 by 51 round. Well, what does this do for us? It fires a bullet that's similar to the 7.62 in weight, but at a speed that's similar to the faster traveling 5.56. How does it do this? It does it by redesigning the entire round and rifle to handle increased chamber pressures. Also, the bullet is a more efficient shape. What is that practical advantage? It's hard to know exactly because the military isn't going to let everybody know the limits of their new equipment. But from what we can tell, it's less affected by the wind, it's flatter shooting, and it can either currently or in the future penetrate modern body armor at distance. It sounds great, but what are the drawbacks? Well, originally the rifle itself was going to weigh 9.4 pounds unloaded for a 13-inch barrel. It's very heavy compared to the 6.6 pound unloaded M4. Unloaded means not just no magazines, but nothing attached to it like sighting systems, lights, lasers, etc. So 9.4 pounds was not great, but within the last couple months they announced an updated version of the gun with a shorter barrel and other weight-saving features that equate to a 7.3 pound rifle for a 10.5-inch barrel. So not only is it lighter, but slightly a little bit more maneuverable. Okay, so that's one problem solved. The next problem is harder to solve, and that's ammo capacity. Because it's a larger round, less of those rounds can fit in a magazine of the same size. The standard magazine size for the 6.8 is a 20-round magazine instead of the 5.56's 30-round magazine. Well, naturally, you'd think just carry more magazines, but the other problem is that the heavier 6.8 round, although slightly lighter than 7.62, weighs almost double that of a 5.56 round. And therein lies the biggest complaint of the whole NGSW program. But the M7 rifle is only half of the NGSW program. The other half is the M50 machine gun, set to replace the M249 SAW. Now, I was a SAW gunner for a couple of years, including a rotation at JRTC. Army people will know what that means. So I can attest to the love-hate relationship soldiers have with this machine gun. So what are the drawbacks of the M249 SAW? If you didn't know, the SAW unloaded weighs 17 pounds, and the gunner is still supposed to maneuver with the rest of the squad. M4s have weight-saving cuts and metal milled out of it to make it lighter and more ergonomic. Meanwhile, the SAW looks like it has spot welds on it. So you're carrying a gun that's double the weight of an M4, but the 5.56 bullet is doing the same thing that it does when coming out of an M4. You just have more of them. Typically, ammunition is issued in 200-round linked belts in a plastic drum that weighs 5 pounds. So if you load a 200-round drum into your 17-pound machine gun, you now have a 22-pound gun. So everyone was just complaining about the 10-pound M7, and we have a bunch of teenagers hauling around 22-pound guns. You know, like I mentioned, most of the time the gunner will split that belt in half and only have a 100-round starter belt using that pouch, and that reduces the weight by a few pounds. But the next thing is slow reloads. You basically have to put it on the ground and use two hands to open the feed tray cover, put a new belt in, hold the belt in place as you close the cover again. It's very easy for the belt of ammunition to become misaligned in the process, and the first time you try to fire from that new belt, the bolt will slam forward and nothing will happen because the rounds are now misaligned in there. So it's very difficult to reload under stress. The next issue is the safety. It is a cross bolt safety, which means you push the button in on the left side and it's on fire. And then that causes the button to now stick out on the right side of the gun. You push the button on the right side and it goes back on safe. The problem with it is that it's slow. And the second problem is that it's the reverse direction that you would want if you were a lefty. So you end up with a choice, especially in close quarters. Do I leave it on safe and take that extra half second or a second to hit the safety if I need to fire? A half second could be a lot of time, especially in close quarters. Or I've seen people do what I would consider the wrong answer, which is leave it on fire when coming around a corner, so that way they don't have to worry about the safety if they need to shoot. They just pull the trigger. Obviously, that goes against major rule of weapon safety that we teach, but that safety is so hard to use that I understand why people tend to do that. The next problem with the SAW to me is that it only fires in full auto. When we're talking about preserving ammunition and making what you're carrying last longer, maybe you want to use suppressive fire to keep the enemy's heads down or distracted while other people maneuver, Potentially single shots could do that without ripping 3 to 5 rounds every time you squeeze the trigger. The other reason single shot is useful is masking your capabilities. I can tell you from a scout's perspective that when we're probing a defensive position, our job is to collect as much information as we can and get close enough to get the enemy to show their hand. At least Army doctrine has the machine guns at the end or the apex of defensive lines. So if you know you're fighting a platoon and you could basically bait a machine gun into firing, you can confidently make some assumptions. But on the flip side, when we are in the defensive positions, we have to make clear to our machine gunners to only fire if the situation meets certain criteria that would make it worth to show our hand. Whether it's only fire at groups of 5 or more, only shoot at vehicles, only shoot at crew served weapons, etc. This leads to situations where a machine gunner might see an enemy or two, but then has to try and communicate that to someone with a rifle to then shoot at what he's seeing because that threat doesn't meet the threshold of machine gun fire yet. And the last issue to me are those 200 round plastic drums. They get really brittle in extreme cold, as you can imagine, and they shatter and you end up just dragging the belt of ammunition behind you. Now I understand the thought process behind the drums, but I'm pretty sure everyone would agree that we prefer the nylon pouches. So how does the M250 solve these problems? Well, it's lighter at 14.5 pounds. 50 round pouch is 3.5 pounds. 100 round pouch is 6.75 pounds. So if you patrol with a 50 round pouch, you're lighter than a loaded saw. The reloads look a lot quicker and easier, especially with the feed tray opening to the side and actually having something that grabs and holds that round in place when you close the cover. I know there's multiple ways to feed in that new belt, but that feature of holding the rounds in place is huge. It has a more modern safety selector like the M4 and the M7, so it's quick and easy to switch back and forth. Now there's zero reason for people at this point to not use the safety. And then finally, it could be fired in semi-auto, so you can actually conserve your ammunition and not give away your key positions. Well, what are the downsides of the M250? Well, same as the M7, right? It's the weight. And what sparked me to want to run some of these numbers is that weight difference. So let's look back at the makeup of a platoon. So you have 21 M4s, 6 Grenadiers, 6 SAWs, 3 DMRs, and 2 M240s. Let's go back to the Marine Corps real quick, because they actually don't have a dedicated light machine gun at the team or squad level anymore. Basically, everyone in the 13-person squad has that M27 rifle, which is capable of automatic fire. And then the M240 machine guns are in a separate heavy weapons platoon that can get detached out to the squads that want or need them. So basically the Marine Corps solution is to get rid of the SAW in the infantry platoon, and one person per fire team will be designated the automatic rifleman and carry extra ammunition to fill that role. So we see two different schools of thought here between the Marine Corps and the Army. The Marine Corps took the heaviest weapon in the platoon away and made a lighter but less capable platoon. The Army replaced their lightest weapon with something that's more capable and are evening out that weight closer to the machine gunner. So let's actually analyze that weight. Let's start with an M4. An M4 with an ACOG and PEG-15 weighs 9 pounds, plus a 30-round magazine brings that up to 10 pounds. If we're considering a 210 round or 7 magazines as a combat load, then let's add 6 more magazines to that for a combat load of a total of 16 pounds for weapons and ammunition. Well, how about the Marine Corps M27? With its VCOG scope, PEG-16, it weighs 11.5 pounds plus a magazine that's 12.6 pounds. You add 6 more magazines to that, that makes a total combat load of 18.6 pounds. So the Marine Corps solution was a slightly heavier gun, and keep in mind that some of them will carry a lot more ammunition as the automatic rifleman. The new lighter M7 is 7.3 pounds, plus the new laser and optic brings it to about 10 pounds, plus a 1.7 pound 20 round magazine. That makes the gun itself loaded 11.7 pounds. Plus 6 magazines brings it up to 21, almost 22 pounds. That's an extra 6 pounds for a third less ammunition. But what if we bump that up to carrying 9 extra magazines to give us a 200 round combat load? That's 27 pounds. Why 200 instead of 210? I'll talk about that later. So that's 27 pounds for the M7 versus the legacy M4 that's only 16 pounds. You're probably thinking 11 more pounds. That's crazy. And yeah, how could anyone possibly move around on foot, let alone in the mountains, when their weapon weighs almost 12 pounds and their combat load of weapon plus ammo weighs almost 30 pounds? That's a great question. Let's move to the other weapon systems in the platoon. So let's talk about the 6th Grenadiers. So they also have the M4, but they also have that 3.5-pound M320 grenade launcher attached to the front of it. That makes the weapon weigh 13.5 pounds. And a lot of that weight is on the front of the weapon, so that makes it very front heavy and actually hard to shoot in any position. Even when shooting off a barricade, it wants to roll to the left or right, so it's hard to keep steady. Okay, so let's add that combat load of 6 magazines and 12 40mm grenades that weigh 0.8 pounds each. That adds to a combat load of 32.3 pounds. Now, just a reminder, the M7 with 200 rounds was an 11.7 pound gun and 27-pound combat load. The M4 Grenadier has a 13.7 pound gun and a 32.3 pound combat load. So what does the Grenadier look like with the M7? Well, I don't know if there's any plans to make the 320 able to attach to the underside of the M7, but if it did, it would make the weapon 15 pounds. Plus 6 magazines would make the total combat load 38 pounds, but carrying that extra ammunition to make a total of 200 rounds of 6.8, 12 rounds of 40mm grenades, that would be a total of 43 pounds. To be honest, that's a lot of firepower, and I'm going to speak on that later in my recommendations. So far, everyone in the platoon's weight has gone up in exchange for the increased capability. But let's talk about the DMR role and the M110A1. So there's 3 of them in the platoon. With an optic, suppressor, and bipod, that gun weighs 13 pounds. Plus the 1.7 pound magazine makes it a 14.7 pound fully loaded rifle. Add 6 more magazines and that's 23.9 pounds compared to the 21.9 pounds for the M7 with the same number of rounds. Let's bump that up to a full combat load of 200, and that's 29 pounds for the M110A1 instead of 27 for the M7. So for the M7, you have a lighter gun and lighter ammunition and increased performance over the M110A1 chambered in 7.62. Okay, now we're trending downward. Let's keep going and talk about the machine guns. The SAW, which there are 6 in the platoon, weighs 17 pounds, plus 3 pounds for the 100-round pouch. That makes the weapon weigh 20 pounds, plus an additional 500 rounds to make a total of 600-round combat load. That would bring the weight to a total of 35 pounds. So that's a 20-pound gun and 35 pounds of full combat load. The 240, for which there are 2 in the platoon, weigh 22 pounds, plus 3.25 pounds for 50-round starter belt. That's a little bit over 25 pounds for the gun itself. And if they carried 500 rounds, that would add an extra 32 pounds for a full combat load of 57, almost 58 pounds. Obviously, that's not realistic, and that would be distributed to the ammo bearer and the team leader. Usually they carry about 200 total rounds, which would make them have a full combat load of 35 pounds with a 25-pound gun. The new M250 itself weighs 14.5 pounds, plus 3-pound 50-round starter belt. So that's a 17.5 pound gun compared to the 20-pound SAW. So it can maneuver a little bit easier than the SAW, but the ammo is a little bit heavier. So if we want to keep the same weight and combat load of the SAW, which is 35 pounds, that would mean carrying 350 rounds as compared to 600 rounds for the SAW. I think this is actually a fair trade-off because its ability to fire in semi-auto. So you could even potentially range with your single shots before switching to automatic fire. Now this is where the Army needs to figure some stuff out because we see the M250 is lighter than the SAW, but it has capabilities that exceed the M240. So is the platoon going to get restructured, or are we going to adapt the larger MG338, which is a bigger version of the M250 that fires a larger round, as a replacement for the M240? So those are the numbers. Is the NGSW heavier? For some in the platoon, yes, but they gain a capability. For some people, the weight actually can go down. Let's talk about some other criticisms I've heard of the M7 specifically. The first one I've heard from a prominent YouTuber, and he said, we'll only engage enemies at 300 yards and closer. If you look at the studies from World War II, Korea, and Russia, Ukraine, you can't even identify enemy past 300 yards. And even if you could, soldiers don't have enough skill to make that shot. Well, my opinion is that that's speculative and also terrain dependent. I'm looking through this in the lens of mountain warfare, where you'll definitely have sight lines at distance. But first, I'll talk about World War II in Korea. Magnified optics weren't anywhere near as common on weapons as they are now. So that's kind of a silly thing to bring up. The next thing is Russia-Ukraine as evidence that all future warfare is going to be at close range. Other people have dove deep into this topic, but a majority of the rifles on both sides only have iron sights. Whether it's lack of funding, how quick both sides had to crank out these conscript soldiers, and the fact that these fights end up being a lot of trench warfare around urban centers and no major breakouts in either direction. I don't think that's representative of how the US military fights, or even how every future conflict is going to be fought. On the skill argument, I can tell you that having shot with many classes of students on the high angle range at the Mountain Warfare School, everyone could hit a silhouette at 300 meters. And the farthest I've personally seen a student hit a silhouette with an M4 and an ACOG is 800 meters, but most can go out to 5 or 6. As you can imagine, it really depends on the wind, and you're really lobbing and barely hearing any feedback from the steel targets because the bullets have lost so much energy. But it can be done, and with a little bit of training, soldiers can hit a 2 MOA target at 800 meters. Do they need to? Not necessarily everyone needs to be able to do that, but in the mountains, that could be a very useful skill to have. The next criticism I heard is that because it's heavy, it's hard to shoot while standing and hard to control in full automatic. Although obviously that's the first thing people do when they pick up the rifle and they shoulder it and they aim at the wall and they see how long they could hold it there. But there's a couple of things to talk about. First is that, like I already talked about earlier, we have weapons that are significantly heavier than the M7 already that we can shoot standing up. Secondly, firing offhand, which is the term for saying standing and not supporting the rifle on anything, isn't really the way we train to fight, right? We're normally taught to get on line and face the threat and return fire from behind cover. If there's no cover around you, you go prone and make yourself a small target. Even less common is having to fire while standing straight up and doing so in full auto, and needing all those shots to be within a single target. I could see that for maybe breaking contact or CQB, but in a mountain warfare scenario, I don't really see that being a priority. The next thing I hear people say is, how are we going to get the X-ray technicians, the admin personnel, and the non-combat MOSs to be able to shoot this heavier rifle? And to that I say, they probably only currently shoot once a year to have a weapons qualification on paper anyway. And if they'd fail a weapons qual with an M7, they'd probably also fail the weapons qual with an M4 anyway. Our weapons qualifications emphasizes shooting in the prone and off of barriers, which isn't the type of shooting that having a heavier weapon would hinder. If people are failing at weapons qualification, my opinion is it's a skill issue rather than the weight of the rifle. And we shouldn't give our combat armed soldiers weaker rifles just because our support personnel can't handle a more powerful and heavier one. Just give the support soldiers pistols along with better pistol training and move on. The next thing I hear people cite is the just get fit fallacy, as if we think that going to the gym and hitting arms will produce more effective soldiers and shooters. When I talk about fitness in the infantry, I'm not talking about shoulders and biceps. I'm talking about legs, core, lower back, and zone 2 cardio. Around 50% of the Army's total infantry are in the National Guard, and it's hard to just roll off the couch once a month and do infantry stuff. It's even harder to do that in the mountains. Hopefully I laid out for you earlier with the numbers. NGSW or not, people are still carrying 35 pounds of just weapons and ammunition. So yes, go to the gym, strengthen the lower back, strengthen your legs, strengthen your core, work on your cardio, and on the days that those body parts are recovering, hit those shoulders and biceps. A platoon can only move as fast as the slowest person, and that's usually the machine gunners. I learned this the hard way when I was a team leader. Well, it wasn't hard for me, it was hard for the other people. I was the alpha team leader for the first squad, so basically I was the first person leading a training patrol. And I led us moving uphill. I would turn around every couple steps, and some people just looked more and more exhausted the farther we went up. And in my head, I'm thinking, I could run up this hill right now, but people are exhausted just walking. Really, the problem was twofold. Yes, I might have been in better shape, but also other people were carrying more weight. Then I learned some of these tricks from mountain guiding. The first one is it's overall faster and less exhausting to go at a slower pace but take fewer breaks. So if you work someone to their absolute limit, it's going to take them a while to recover. So you can work people hard for about 30 minutes, but they might need another 30 minutes to recover after that. Whereas you could do something like 50 minutes of less exhausting work and then a 5 to 10 minute break. And then after a few cycles of that, the slower group will have moved farther and feel less exhausted. The other trick I learned is letting people know that we're only going to move for 50 minutes at a time. And mentally, that's easier for their brain to count down. Like, okay, we've been going at it for 35 minutes. This sucks, but I could do it for another 15 minutes before I need a break. Instead of mentally letting people's mind wander saying, this sucks and I don't know when we're ever going to stop. Now, despite my rebuttal to some of this criticism, I'm not saying that all the criticism is bad or wrong. In fact, I think that the criticism has pushed SIG into figuring out how to make the rifle lighter and is overall going to be better for soldiers. Who knows if they would have done that or done it so soon without people voicing their concern. I myself do have some criticism for the program, mainly that I don't like the optic. I don't think a 1 to 8 power mil reticle scope with a laser rangefinder is the right tool for the job for every soldier. I think something maybe with a bullet drop compensator would be a lot easier to use and have less electronic parts. Okay, so let's move on to my recommendations for the program. The first thing is, while we're talking about weight and we're shuffling around weapon systems, let's take a look at what equipment we actually need, what can we make lighter, and what can we adjust for our mannings and tactics. I've talked about it before, I'm going to keep talking about it, and that's the use of trekking poles. The average 165-pound person has an arm weight about 10 pounds. So without even pushing down on the trekking pole using their muscles, using just the weight of their arm, you can transfer 10 pounds off your legs to your arms. This helps us move faster and reduces the likelihood of lower leg injuries on our movements. Trail runners know this, backcountry hunters know this, and long-distance hikers know this. They don't impede your ability to fight because it takes a split second to just let go of them and grab your rifle. I have seen some units use them, but it still doesn't seem like the norm for Mountain Infantry units yet. And if we're counting pounds and we're adding weight, let's look at the pounds we could take off of our legs. The next option is to ditch the pistol. That's 4 extra pounds of gun and ammo and holster on your leg. That's not everybody needs, especially in the mountains. If you look at not only 9mm effective range, but also the skill level of a typical shooter with a pistol in the military, there are very few circumstances that a pistol would be useful. For that same weight, you could add at least 2 6.8 magazines. My next option is to consider ditching that suppressor. Listen, fighting is already loud, ear pro technology has come a long way, and I don't think that every infantry soldier needs a suppressor all the time. I think it adds weight to the rifle at the furthest out point, which is the most cumbersome place to add weight. Also, especially for the machine guns, they could potentially start to heat up and glow under night vision after rapid fire. Supposedly, these SIG suppressors have an extra shield around them to mitigate that a little bit, but it might be something worth considering. I like that they have the capability to shoot with a suppressor, especially for scouts, but for everyone all the time to have a suppressor on seems like a little bit too much. Next, let's consider what a combat load consists of. Currently for the M4, we carry 210 rounds, which is 7 magazines of 30 rounds each. Where does that come from? Well, I read a book a while ago called The Soldier's Load and the Mobility of a Nation, written by a Marine Corps colonel in the 80s. And he attributed the 200 rounds to the Prussians of the 1800s, although he says he doesn't know of any tactical or logistical reason for it. In World War II, Americans who stormed the beaches were allowed to reduce their combat loads for their M1 Garands from 120 rounds down to 80 rounds. Then at the start of the Vietnam War, they carried 6 magazines of 20 rounds each for their M14s. When the M16 started getting issued, they increased to 7 magazines of 30 rounds, and that became our current 210 round combat load. I guess all this is to say that that number is ambiguous. No one really knows where it comes from, where it started, and we've had 50 years of carrying 30 round magazines, so our setups are pretty optimized for that. It's going to take some growing pains to learn how to use 20 round magazines, but I think we can figure out the best way to optimize it on our kit and how much ammunition to carry. So much like I did earlier with reducing the combat load for the M250 because I can shoot semi-auto, let's reevaluate the numbers versus capabilities. I said we probably don't need 2 grenade launchers in every squad, and the Grenadier probably doesn't need a full combat load of 10 magazines in addition to their 12 40mm grenades. Right? They could probably reduce some of the numbers of magazines and grenades that they carry to offset the weight. Lastly, of course, if we have a rifle that can be lethal out to 600 meters, we should routinely be shooting out that far. I think as an army in general, we should be working towards positional shooting, using barricades, and getting into and out of good shooting positions quickly, and that would allow us to actually take longer shots, similar to shots that are taken at precision rifle shooting matches. I'll leave you with this. 540 soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment, also known as Task Force Smith, were the first Americans to see ground combat in the Korean War. Still riding high from their victories in World War II, generally the thought was that we could just nuke our way to victory in the next war. There was little to no innovation when it came to infantry tactics, training, and equipment. When North Korea launched a surprise attack and pushed farther south into South Korea, Task Force Smith was flown in from Japan with the mission to delay the North Korean troops from moving south from Seoul to the rest of the peninsula. The plan was to give the Army more time to get troops into South Korea. Task Force Smith moved north and set up defensive positions on either side of the highway leading to the town of Osan. On July 5, 1950, 3 days after taking those defensive positions, there was 33 North Korean T-34 tanks that rolled south along the highway. The Americans had never faced Soviet armor before and watched as artillery and bazookas bounced off the tank without doing any damage. The only munitions that could defeat the T-34 were the artillery's high-explosive anti-tank rounds, also called heat rounds, of which they only had 6. With those 6 rounds, they destroyed 2 tanks and disabled 2 more. But besides that, the rest of the tanks rolled through the positions, barely even taking time to fire back. Task Force Smith's job was to delay the armored column, and although they were able to destroy a few of them, there were still 29 North Korean tanks that got past them. And even worse, this was just the advance party. What followed was a second column of 25 tanks, and then thousands of North Korean infantry. The outcome was an American withdrawal with 150 American soldiers dead, wounded, or missing, while the North Koreans lost 127 soldiers and 4 tanks. Overall, North Koreans were delayed only a few hours, but that gave other Americans time to set up more defensive positions, which the North Koreans again rolled right through days later. It took a month until the Americans, South Koreans, and British soldiers could finally hold back the North Korean advance. Now, the US did have upgraded bazookas and artillery that could have destroyed the North Korean armor, but didn't issue it out to the 21st Infantry Regiment because they weren't produced in high quantities, and also it was thought that they weren't needed. Are we seeing some possible parallels here? So I hear people saying that the NGSW is the Army's attempt at fighting its last war. But my view is it's our attempt to innovate and get out ahead of the next war. A war where airspace is contested, communications is degraded, and our enemy is also wearing body armor. A fight where infantry once again needs to dominate a half kilometer with no outside help. And in a fight like that, I'd rather have a useful 10-pound rifle than a useless 7-pound rifle. Well, that was a long one. I'll post my notes and data from this on mountainmaneuvers.com. If you made it all the way to the end, thanks for listening.